Have you ever felt the hairs on the back of your neck rise at the thought of what might be lurking just beyond the light? Well, today we take a journey into Drakensberg for an incredible discovery and then a first-hand account of a creature locals call the Mungwa. Are these stories mere legends woven from fear or evidence of something far more tangible and terrifying? Together, we shall find out. Welcome to Weird Encounters, a place where the ordinary fades into shadow and the unexplainable comes alive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and become part of our ever-growing community of the curious. Now prepare yourself, because what you are about to hear is not for the faint of heart. I apologize if this message jumps around. My nerves have been on edge ever since I left the Drakensberg region in South Africa. I was part of a private geological survey team working alongside some local university researchers near the Ingisuthi area, just southeast of the towering Cathkin Peak. It was a standard enough arrangement, or so I thought. The government sponsored us, though not officially, of course, to map and sample rock layers believed to contain ancient fossils. I've always been fascinated by paleontology, so naturally I felt privileged to be there. But what we discovered was far beyond fossils or petrified dinosaur bones. The reason I'm sending this email is because of the thick cloud of secrecy thrown over everything we uncovered. It all started when our ground-penetrating radar flagged what we thought could be a cluster of large skeletal remains. At first, I joked with one of the team members, a friend of mine named Gert, that maybe we'd found the legendary monsters local folklore always hinted at. We chuckled then, like idiots who had no idea what was coming. Anyway, we marked the coordinates, roped off the area, and requested more advanced excavation tools from our sponsor, whoever they actually were. That's when about a dozen new workers arrived out of nowhere, presumably subcontractors. We'd never seen them before. They wore brand new boots, carried brand new equipment, and barely spoke to us. Only to each other. It was like they had some prior knowledge of what they'd find. My friend Lasidi, who is from nearby Pietermaritzburg, said she overheard them referring to the big guy in the rock more than once in their conversations. She told me, in an offhand manner, it sounded almost playful, but underneath there was a tension that set her teeth on edge. The dig didn't take long to confirm something massive was under there. We uncovered a series of bones that seemed way out of proportion to anything I've seen in legitimate paleontological literature. Humanoid, but not. The skull alone was nearly triple the size of an average adult human's, with a jaw that could swallow a melon whole. The tibias and femurs indicated something that would stand, if upright, easily over 9 or 10 feet tall, perhaps even closer to 12 feet, given the incomplete remains. Every time I pressed the new arrivals for some explanation, they'd shrug me off and mention that the local legends did talk about Inzuthu people, rumored to be giant ancestors. I'd never heard that particular legend, but I've since learned that various groups have stories of enormous primal beings. At first, it was awe-inspiring, thinking we stumbled onto definitive proof of giant hominids. Then, everything shifted. A few days after our initial find, 2 black SUVs with tinted windows rolled up near our base camp. They had official government plates, sort of. The plates looked somewhat official, but not quite matching standard numbering. That evening, a group of official-looking men, SAPs, or maybe some special government branch, approached our lead archaeologist, Dr. Thompson. She clammed right up about everything afterward. As far as I know, they threatened us with legal ramifications for disclosing anything we'd seen. I heard from a couple local hikers at the time. One was an older gentleman named Eben, who said he'd been coming to that region for decades because of strange lights and unusual voices echoing at night. He'd always thought it might be local spirits or something from old Zulu legends. Another time, a group of teenage campers scrambled down the same trail, saying they glimpsed a massive skull that looked too real to be a prop. They took a few pictures, but their phones mysteriously had no images the next day. They swore something had wiped their data. After that, strange men wearing unmarked uniforms started systematically clearing out any bystanders from the vicinity. I remember this one moment distinctly. We heard the rotor blades of a helicopter around midday, and suddenly the entire site was sealed off. My team was forced to relocate to a makeshift camp half a mile away. Our instruments, camera gear, even the GPR logs, they took them, whisked them away in large plastic containers. Nobody offered us any explanation. Dr. Thompson wouldn't meet my eyes. Gert approached me at one point and said in low tones that we should slip out that evening because he was concerned for our safety. Lasidi refused to leave until she had at least some proof, some fragment to show the world. So she smuggled out a few small bone shards, maybe an inch or two each in length. I actually saw them. They looked like hominid bone, but with a different texture and density from standard modern human bones. That's the last time I saw them. Lasidi disappeared a few days after that, right as we completed the assignment and were told to go home. I tried calling her, tried emailing. Nothing. Friends in Pietermaritzburg say she vanished without a trace, and the local authorities claimed it was simply a missing person case they had no leads on. The bigger the puzzle got, the more uneasy I felt. I tracked down rumors of similar finds in the area. Apparently, a rumored giant skull discovered in 1956 near the Royal Natal National Park. It was quickly covered up. Then again in 1977, there were whispers of an oversized skeleton in the Giant's Castle region. Each time the story ended the same. Official lockdown, site sealed, no official record. Some folks attribute it to local superstition, or natural illusions, or misidentification. But there's too much repetition, too many hush-hush visits by official sorts to be coincidence. When I reached out to an acquaintance in Johannesburg about it, a contact in the anthropology department, he was polite, but his words were that it's not wise to dig deeper. He mentioned the National Intelligence Agency has an interest in archaeological anomalies, especially if they can't easily be explained away. I figured maybe the government doesn't want to panic the public or encourage treasure hunters, but it feels far bigger than that. There's a sense that these remains, if made public, could rewrite something fundamental about human history or about other species that once roamed the earth. That's the gist of my story. I can't prove a thing anymore, seeing as they cleaned out our entire site and confiscated everything. I only hope Lasidi is somewhere safe. I hope those men in black SUVs don't come for me the way they came for the rest of the crew's data. I don't know how many people got threatened into silence, but if you folks want to know the truth about what's hidden in the Drakensberg, this is my contribution. Those are the sort of secrets that lurk beyond the tourist trails, beyond the brochures and guided tours. A whisper of giants, an echo of lost chapters in our history. Perhaps all it takes is one fleeting glimpse before reality itself shifts under your feet. But now let's listen to a story that whispers in the tall grass, of glimpses in the moonlight, and of a creature that belongs more in nightmares than on travel brochures. Brace yourselves. I think I've lost my mind. But I know what I saw, and so do the local villagers who've been telling these stories for generations. Let me just start from the beginning before my memory clouds over like it tends to do when I'm jittery. Last September, I took a safari vacation in Tanzania, planning to see the famous Serengeti migration. I'd saved up for years, dreaming of that classic scene of wildebeest and zebras forging across rivers teeming with crocodiles. It was a small group tour, just me, my friend Tamara, an older couple from Germany, and a few other travelers. Our guide, Jabari, was from a village near the Ngorongoro conservation area. He was a tall, quiet man, the kind who had a calm about him, like he'd seen more than he let on. The journey started off beautifully. We drove across dusty roads, eyes glued to the golden plains that stretched out to the horizon. Occasionally, we passed Maasai herders in their bright red robes, tending cattle under that endless sky. And then one evening, after we'd set up our tents in a designated campsite near the Morukopjes, Jabari told us about the local legends, the ones seldom mentioned in the standard safari itinerary. He said there was an elusive creature that local folks called mungwa, an enormous feline that was neither lion nor leopard. The older couple from Germany snapped pictures of him telling the story, but I recall him glancing over his shoulder every so often, as if checking for something lurking in the tall grass. He never outright said it was real, at least not then. Yet I sensed an edge to his tone that made the hair on my arms prickle. We spent a few days traveling deeper into the reserve. Every night, a small team from the local village would help us set up camp. One of them, a young man named Sefu, mentioned that people in his grandmother's generation lost goats, even children, to something they called the shadow cat. Whenever I pressed him for details, he'd look uncomfortable. He spoke in bits and pieces, referencing old folk songs that warned the children not to wander after dark. One particular night, this was near the Serenera area, I had a restless feeling. The daytime heat had been suffocating, and we all huddled around a lantern after dinner, sipping lukewarm tea. Tamara was updating her travel journal. I remember I was just about to turn in when I heard a low, growling sort of hiss from the blackness beyond our camp's edge. Jabari grabbed his flashlight and scanned the darkness. Nothing. But I swear every fiber of my being told me there was something out there, crouched just out of reach of the light. The next morning, we found tracks around the perimeter of our campsite, bigger than any leopards I'd ever seen documented in wildlife guides. The prints were rounder, deeper, and spaced in a way that suggested a heft beyond the typical Serengeti cats. Even Jabari, who was usually unflappable, looked rattled. He pointed to them, then pointed north, indicating the direction they trailed off. That day, we drove out to a local village on the edge of the park to resupply. Word must have spread that we'd seen prints. A few elders approached us under a large acacia tree, gently cautioning us that this was not a normal lion or a stray big cat. They told us it was the mungwa or the nunda, depending on which family's legend you asked. Some claimed it was a spirit, others said it was a flesh and blood creature that hunts alone, silent as a breeze. One elder woman, leaning on her walking stick, indicated that her own grandfather witnessed it snatch a calf back in the 1950s. She said it vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving only a streak of dark fur and massive claw marks in the dirt. I remember the villagers insisted we avoid certain areas at night, especially near thick patches of brush or rocky outcrops. Their stories varied. Some said the cryptid was enormous, with a smoky gray coat and eyes that glowed like embers. Others insisted it was almost black as midnight. Sefu came forward again, quietly recounting a childhood memory of hearing an unearthly screech behind his family's hut, then finding chicken carcasses scattered with no discernible pattern. He'd never forget the eyes shining in the darkness. A day later, we were returning to our campsite after an evening game drive when we saw something slink across the road. It was just beyond the glow of our Jeep's headlights. I couldn't get a perfect look, but it was definitely a cat, much larger than any leopard or even a big lioness I'd ever seen in zoos back home. Tamara gasped. Jabari slowed the vehicle. There was a second or two where this shape turned its head in our direction. The headlights caught a glint, like copper fire in its eyes, and then it disappeared into the tall grass. I can't adequately express the tension inside that Jeep. Nobody spoke for what felt like an eternity. The atmosphere had shifted into something primal, like we'd just stepped out of bounds. We pressed on. That night, I couldn't sleep. Tamara told me she heard rustling around the perimeter again, but I was sitting bolt upright in my tent, ears straining for any sound. Every time the wind picked up, I thought it was the creature breathing. At some point, the night quieted completely, a deafening kind of silence. It dawned on me that even the insects and night birds had gone still. By morning, I was ready to cut the trip short, and I'm not one to spook easily. The older German couple, though, seemed oddly curious. They wanted to see more tracks, perhaps snap a few pictures for their wildlife collection. Sefu, on the other hand, insisted that we should leave at once. He kept saying that once the Mengwa targets you, it follows you for days. His anxiousness spread to Jabari, who made some calls on his radio. He arranged for us to head toward the main gates of the park earlier than scheduled. I felt relieved, though disappointed in a way, because I'd wanted to see more of the wildlife in a safer context. On our way back, we heard an unsettling report from rangers that a Maasai herder had lost 3 goats the previous night under bizarre circumstances. No typical lion tracks, just strange, oversized paw prints. The goats were taken from inside a makeshift enclosure. Everyone was on high alert. Some rangers even muttered that the shadow cat had returned. Their voices had that unmistakable mix of dread and resignation that comes when you know there's a threat, but you can't confront it directly. I admit, I came home to the States feeling uneasy. I Googled everything I could about the Mengwa or Nunda, found a few references in older explorer journals, but not enough to satisfy me. It's almost like an open secret among some locals and a few travel veterans. But it's not something the tourist boards would ever talk about, that's for sure. Some folks claim the story is just an offshoot of local lore designed to keep children in line. Others swear it's a distinct species, maybe a mutation of a giant leopard, and still others whisper that it's a spirit, capable of crossing between worlds. I have no definitive answer. All I know is, I saw something that defied any normal explanation, and I felt fear in a way I never had before. Whether it's an undiscovered cryptid or a living legend, it's left an impression on me that lingers long after the safari ended. Sometimes I dream about those burning eyes in the dark grass. I wake up covered in sweat, half expecting to see paw prints by my bedroom door. That's all I can really say. Take it for what it's worth, but I believe there are mysteries out there that we're not meant to see until we stumble upon them in the stillness of an African night. Stay safe, everyone, and watch your backs if you find yourselves out in the savannah after dark. A creeping presence out on the sun-scorched plains, unseen but never quite absent. Is it just another tall tale shared around the campfire, or something else entirely? Perhaps in the silence of the African night, under the brilliant spray of stars, a nameless creature still prowls the bushveld, waiting to be revealed. This isn't one of those run-of-the-mill tall tales folks spin around a campfire. What you're about to hear is the kind of account that makes you wonder if we've truly discovered all there is to discover in the world. Tonight, our story leads us into the very heart of Saratoga National Historical Park in upstate New York. I've been working as a park ranger at Saratoga National Historical Park for a little over 9 years now, long enough to see nearly everything. Kids sneaking into restricted areas at dusk, hoping for a thrill, clusters of amateur ghost hunters wandering around the old Bemis Heights after hearing local legends, and out-of-towners who haven't the faintest idea about how quickly the weather can shift here. But these typical encounters don't hold a candle to what I saw out there just a few weeks back. It was nearing the end of September, somewhere around the 23rd or 24th. The summer crowds had gradually thinned, leaving the park in one of its quieter phases. I find that time of year fascinating. The transition between lively, bustling days and the sounds and smells of autumn creeping in. The trees were beginning to shed their leaves, piling them in crunchy carpets along the trails. That evening, I was strolling through my usual patrol routes, which sometimes involve checking the grounds near the Schuyler house or ensuring no one's camping illegally over by Bemis Heights. It seemed no more eventful than any other night, except for one unsettling detail. The woods were silent. Not the comforting lull of nighttime quiet, but a deeper stillness, as though every creature had evacuated. I headed toward the Barber Wheatfield area, a spot that can turn swampy when the rains come. It's an area steeped in Revolutionary War lore, and sometimes visitors leave small memorabilia or patriotic tokens on the property lines. Now, a few local hikers had warned me about footprints they couldn't explain, long, thin shapes in the mud that looked disturbingly human yet far too big. At first, I dismissed it as a hoax or maybe someone's creative attempt to stir up supernatural rumors. I even joked with my coworker, Janet, about it, telling her that some folks just enjoy scaring themselves. She wasn't so quick to laugh, though, saying that in Schuylerville, rumors fly about mysterious entities roaming the old battlegrounds, clinging like shadows. As I approached a small clearing behind the visitor center, a space that offers a glimpse of the moody autumn sky, I noticed a figure at the far edge. I remember the moon that night being just a sliver in the sky, hardly enough light to see by, but somehow it still illuminated this shape. My first reflex was to assume it was a stray camper, or maybe even one of our reenactor volunteers who had gotten turned around in the darkness. But the longer I looked, the more I realized something was very wrong. This figure stood in a manner that made me uneasy. It swayed gently, like it was off balance or maybe disoriented, but there was this tension in its outline, as if its limbs didn't quite fit together. I tried to call out, ask if they needed help, but my voice failed me. It was as if my body instinctively knew to stay quiet, not to draw attention, because the presence I was looking at wasn't normal. When I finally got close enough for my flashlight beam to flicker over it, I nearly dropped the light. The thing looked human, but in an impossibly distorted way, like someone had stretched its arms just a bit too long and given it a posture more suited to a hunched animal. And that face, pale skin that seemed slick or waxy, and what should have been eyes were these hollow, sunken sockets. I only caught the barest glimpse before it whipped its head in my direction, making a sickening creak like dry branches rubbing together. Now, I consider myself fairly level-headed. I've heard ghost stories since I was a kid, and I typically chalk weird sightings up to an overactive imagination. But that instant, a wave of dread surged through me. I groped for my radio, thinking maybe I could quietly request backup. Yet my thoughts were scrambled, words refused to form. Next thing I knew, I'd taken a step back, snapping twigs beneath my boots. That noise snapped the figure's gaze fully onto me, and in one horrifying lurch, it jerked forward. My mind was racing a mile a minute. I vaguely remembered that the Hudson River lay just a short distance east from there. I'd once been told about drownings or unexplained disappearances in these parts, but that recollection didn't offer any comfort. It just made me panic more. As the figure took that step, I bolted. I didn't even think about it. My legs were moving before I registered the decision. I might have dropped my flashlight. I have a hazy memory of the beam skittering across rocks as I tore away from the clearing. My only clear thought was that I had to get out, get somewhere safe, away from the thing that seemed too bizarre to be real. I can't precisely tell you how long it took me to reach the ranger station. It felt like a lifetime. My lungs burned with every breath, branches slapped my arms and face, and the darkness seemed almost oppressive, pressing down on me. Once inside, I collapsed against the counter, and my coworker, Marcus, stared at me like I'd lost my mind. When I finally sputtered out what had happened, he gave me this look of grave understanding, as if he'd already heard similar tales. I remember him fiddling with some paperwork on his desk, avoiding direct eye contact, as though sharing too many details might invite more trouble. Later, Marcus mentioned that a handful of visitors reported seeing something that might match what I'd encountered. One described a tall, pallid silhouette weaving between the tree trunks over by the old Nielsen farm site. Another said they spotted what looked like a person dragging one leg in a strange gait near the Freeman Farm overlook, vanishing into the gloom. We never officially document these sightings because, well, they never quite fit into any formal report. And on top of that, who wants to be the ranger who files a claim that reads, "Encountered humanoid creature with hollow eyes in the park after nightfall"? That's a quick way to get yourself a reputation or maybe a mandatory evaluation. Truth is, I'm convinced we're dealing with something that's either ancient or deeply tied to the darker layers of this land. I spoke with an older farmer who lives near Stillwater, and he swore he watched a gaunt figure slink across his field late one night, startling his horses into a frenzy. Then there was my friend, a retired state trooper, who told me in hushed tones about a call she handled a few years back involving a frightened young teenager who claimed to have seen a face that wasn't a face peering out from behind a fallen tree trunk along the Victory Woods trails. She said the kid was so shaken he refused to leave his house after dark for months. It's enough to make you question whether certain legends aren't just cautionary tales, but real glimpses of what's lurking in the shadows. Whenever I try to reason this out, my mind returns to the fleeting details. That bent posture, the elongated arms, the breathy, rattling exhale it made. It's not something you see in your average ghost or spirit account. I've heard of shapeshifters or cryptid sightings in other parts of the country, like the stories that float around in the Southwest about skinwalkers or the reported dogman sightings in the Midwest. But I never expected anything like that in the heart of upstate New York, especially not in the well-traveled corners of Saratoga National Historical Park. Then again, old land means old secrets, right? The Revolutionary War might have scarred these fields in more ways than one. If negative energy or tragedy can leave behind spiritual echoes, maybe something else can take form in that vacuum. These days, I'm pretty uneasy about patrolling alone, especially once the sun drops below the horizon. There have been nights I've come close to refusing to lock up by myself, though pride keeps me from saying that out loud too often. I can't walk the trails without constantly glancing over my shoulder, certain I'll catch a glimpse of something moving behind the tree line. My coworkers have started to notice. Some shrug it off as nerves, while others give me a sympathetic nod, as if to say they've felt that creeping dread too, but no one wants to bring it out into the open. What I really want is for people to consider that maybe, just maybe, we don't have all the answers. The world is a lot bigger and stranger than we like to pretend. Sure, it's easy to laugh off unexplained stories as hokey folklore or the ravings of an over-imaginative mind. But if you were standing there in the clearing, if you saw that silhouette and felt that cold, tangible fear wash over you, you'd realize some mysteries resist tidy explanations. So, to everyone listening, if you find yourself strolling these grounds when dusk settles in, do yourself a favor and pay attention to every sudden stillness, every shadow that seems just a touch too tall. I'm not saying you should panic, but being cautious might save you a lifetime of questions, or worse. This place, as beautiful and historically rich as it is, holds tight to certain secrets, ones that don't show up on any map or pamphlet. That's all I've got, really. I'm not an expert on the supernatural or paranormal. I'm just a park ranger who stumbled onto something that defies rational thinking. Sharing it here is the closest I can get to peace of mind, hoping someone out there has seen something similar, or at least can assure me I'm not losing it. They say the roar of Niagara Falls can be heard for miles, a booming constant that draws tourists by the millions. But underneath that thunderous backdrop, there are pockets of eerie silence and dark corners where not every scream is drowned out. My name is Jared, and I'm a park ranger assigned to the Niagara Falls State Park region on the American side. Been here going on 5 years now. You'd be surprised at how busy we stay year-round, even in the colder months, dealing with everything from lost tourists to daring souls who want the perfect nighttime view of the illuminated falls. Normally, I just have to worry about folks testing the boundaries near the railing or sneaking onto slippery rocks for that perfect selfie. Never did I expect to encounter something that still haunts me every time I pass Prospect Point at dusk. About 2 weeks ago, I drew an evening shift, the type of schedule that usually ends with me walking through the park after most visitors have cleared out. It was close to 10 p.m. when I got a radio call from a local officer stationed near Goat Island, telling me someone reported hearing screams coming from the wooded area just south of Three Sisters Islands. Instinctively, I rolled my eyes, assuming it was probably a coyote or maybe a group of rowdy teenagers daring each other to wade in the shallow rapids. But the tone of the call unsettled me. There was a particular seriousness, like the officer had already tried to brush it off and couldn't. I headed that way, making a mental note to be extra careful. The rapids near Three Sisters can be deceptively dangerous, and it's not the first time we've had to rescue someone who lost their footing. By the time I got to the bridge that leads toward the islands, the night had taken on that strange quiet that sometimes settles here off-season. A swirling quiet, punctuated by the thunderous white noise of the falls in the distance. I shined my flashlight across the pathway, half expecting to see a raccoon or maybe an abandoned bag. Instead, the beam caught on something else, footprints in the mud, bigger than any I usually see from typical visitors. I paused, debating whether to radio this in, but decided to check out the surrounding woods first. As I ventured into the small cluster of trees just off the main path, the wind kicked up, rustling the leaves overhead. It was a clear night, so the moon lent enough glow for me to see outlines of tree trunks and brush. That's when I heard it. This faint, low wail that sent a chill right through my jacket. It wasn't the shriek of a coyote, or the muffled cry of a person injured. It was deeper, more drawn out, almost like the moan of something in pain or anger. I'll admit, my heart pounded as I followed the sound further from the lit walkway. I eventually found a narrow, muddy trail that led me to the edge of the river, where the water churns in a powerful current before plummeting over the falls. The moonlight made everything glisten, and the constant roar of Niagara offered an uneasy soundtrack. Suddenly, another scream tore through the air. Much closer this time. I nearly dropped my flashlight. By instinct, I called out, asking if someone needed help, but all I got in return was my own voice echoing back. I scanned the underbrush with my light. My beam fell upon a shape crouched against a fallen log, but it dashed out of sight before I could focus. I froze, trying to decide if I should follow it or call for backup. That's when a memory hit me. A coworker once told me about seeing tall, distorted figures scuttling near the gorge at night. They'd brushed it off as a trick of the eye, maybe shadows cast by the streetlights reflecting off the mist. But my gut told me something more was at play. I inched forward, shining the light between the trees, and stumbled upon what looked like drag marks in the damp soil, as though something had been pulled or had crawled. I could feel the hair on my arms stand up, and I found myself half hoping I'd spot a large, injured animal so I could rationalize everything. But the prints, the spacing, and the wailing sounds didn't fit any wildlife I knew. The further I went, the more it felt like I was heading into territory that wasn't meant for me. At one point, I swore I saw a faint figure, tall and hunched, maybe 20 yards away, moving in a lurching, unnatural manner between two large oaks. My flashlight battery started flickering at the worst possible time, forcing me to tap it to keep the beam steady. Every time the light flickered, my heart jumped. The figure seemed to vanish, only to reappear in a slightly different position, almost like it was deliberately staying on the edges of my vision. Then came the scream again. This time, it sounded like it was right behind me. I spun around so fast I lost my footing and slid on the wet leaves, landing hard enough to jolt my knee. The flashlight flew from my hand and rolled a few feet away. I scrambled for it, shining it wildly in all directions, expecting something to leap at me. Nothing did. But the feeling of being watched was so strong I could practically taste it. My radio crackled just then with the same officer's voice, asking if I'd found anything. I could barely speak, my chest tightening as if the presence in those woods was constricting the air around me. After a few shaky breaths, I managed to say that I hadn't found a person in distress, but that I did hear strange noises. I left out the part about the footprints and the hunched figure. I still couldn't wrap my head around that, and I knew how crazy it'd sound if I reported something so vague. I figured I could do a quick sweep and get the hell out of there, then come back with backup if needed. I pressed on for another 10 minutes, which felt like an hour, scanning the woods until I reached a small clearing closer to the water's edge. The lights from the Canadian side flickered across the river, giving the environment an almost surreal glow. Another shape darted across the clearing, fast, too fast to be human, but upright in a way that no animal around here normally moves. It let out that same unnerving scream, and I realized with horror that it was definitely no coyote. My entire body went numb, my instincts screaming at me to leave. Finally, I listened to them. I bolted toward the main path, gripping my flashlight so tight my knuckles ached. The whole time, I expected to feel something claw at my back or yank me to the ground. Once I reached the paved walkway, the floodlights and the distant hum of people still milling near the lit falls gave me a small measure of comfort. A family in matching jackets passed by, oblivious to the fear etched across my face. I didn't stop. I just made for the ranger station, my pulse pounding. Back inside, my coworker, Leslie, asked if I'd found the source of the screams. I just shrugged and muttered it might have been a false alarm. Leslie gave me this look that said they didn't buy it for a second. Later, when the station was emptier, Leslie admitted they'd heard rumors of something akin to a wendigo, or cryptid creature, rumored to roam the wooded pockets around the falls, especially off-season when fewer tourists are around. People talk about hearing horrifying shrieks at night, about seeing tall silhouettes slipping between trees along the gorge. Most chalk it up to local folklore, but you can't help but notice how the park seems to breathe differently in those hidden areas, how the wind can carry a scream further than you'd expect. I tried to sleep that night, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw that hunched shape and heard those cries echoing through my head. For days afterward, I avoided that section of the park after dark, making excuses to patrol in more crowded spots. I'm not entirely sure what I encountered, only that it wasn't something I could easily explain away. Some nights, I wonder if all the legends about creatures along the Niagara Gorge have more truth to them than we'd like to admit. I'm putting my story out here in the hope that if anyone else has come across these ungodly screams or seen that tall, fast-moving figure lurking in the trees, they'll know they're not alone. Niagara Falls State Park might be a tourist hotspot by day, but when the crowds disappear and the mist settles in, there are corners of it that feel like another world entirely. Even the mighty roar of the falls can't completely drown out the uncanny things that roam under the moonlight. If you happen to be near Three Sisters Islands and hear a scream that doesn't sound quite human, maybe think twice before charging into the dark, because sometimes you find answers you didn't want to find. There's a quiet stretch of coast along Fire Island National Seashore, off the southern shore of Long Island, New York, a place known for its calm bay waters, steady breezes, and the persistent call of seagulls overhead. But sometimes, what looks calm can turn unsettling, especially when you wander just beyond the familiar shoreline. My name's Mark, and I've been fishing these waters around Fire Island for a good part of 30 years. My usual routine involves launching my small skiff from Captree State Park, just across the bay from Fire Island. Sometimes, when I'm feeling adventurous, I'll slip in at Watch Hill or even take a ferry from Patchogue out to the barrier beach and wander the shore with my rod in hand. I've always had respect for this place. Anyone who knows Fire Island can tell you it's got a vibe all its own. But I never expected it to unnerve me the way it did last Tuesday. It started as just another early morning trip. I arrived around dawn, cutting my way through the chill and that faint smell of salt lingering in the air. I decided to try some surf casting along the beach near the Otis Pike High Dune Wilderness. People sometimes forget there's a whole stretch of relatively untouched shoreline there, and I like the solitude. I parked at the small lot near Watch Hill and trekked along the sand with my gear. It was quiet enough that I could hear my own breathing between the crashing waves. Nothing out of the ordinary, or so I thought. I'd been there maybe half an hour, tossing my lure into the surf, feeling that gentle tug of the current as it pulled the line. I got no bites, so I decided to move further down the beach. That's when I noticed something in the sand a little ways inland, near the foot of some dunes. From a distance, it looked like some scattered debris, maybe driftwood or garbage that had washed up. I grumbled to myself about people littering, deciding I might pick it up on my way back if it wasn't too big. But as I got closer, I saw tracks, big ones, spaced out in a weird pattern that made my heart skip a beat. I'm no expert tracker, unlike some folks I know who hunt in these parts, but I can generally tell a dog print from a deer or fox. These weren't like anything I'd seen before. Each print looked vaguely like a foot, but longer, narrower, and with toe marks that stretched into points. It was almost as if something had 3 or 4 elongated toes that dug into the sand, each leaving a distinct groove behind. I touched one of the prints just to confirm it wasn't some trick of the wind. The indent was deep and crisp, which meant it was fresh, likely made within the last few hours. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I realized just how big these tracks were, maybe 10 or 11 inches from heel to toe, if you could call it a heel. Now, I've fished a lot of places, Montauk, Shinnecock, even upstate in Lake Ontario, and I've encountered all sorts of wildlife, coyotes skulking around dunes, deer trotting across beaches, even the occasional seal. But this was different. As I scanned around, I noticed the prints seemed to run in a curving path, snaking away from the water's edge. I followed them about 100 yards, right up to where the dunes rose higher, scattered with beach grass. Then they stopped. It wasn't like they continued into the grass. It was as if whatever made them just vanished. There was no sign of scuffing, slipping, or footprints turning around. I kept thinking to myself, maybe it's a big dog with an injured paw, or maybe it's some local trickster wearing homemade plaster cast shoes. But I couldn't shake this heaviness in my gut that warned me something else was going on. The strangest part was how quiet everything got the minute I started examining those prints. No seagulls, no ocean breeze rattling the dune grass, no footsteps from other beachgoers. Just a tense, overwhelming silence, like the beach itself was holding its breath. After a while, I decided to poke around the dunes a bit, see if there was any sign of more prints. About 50 feet further, I found a dead horseshoe crab flipped on its back, shell cracked open. Normally, you'd blame seagulls or raccoons for messing with a beached crab, but the gouges in the shell looked almost too precise, as if carved by claws. I felt an unsettling chill creep up my spine. I'd heard local stories, people whispering about sightings of weird canine-like creatures or rumored cryptids near Fire Island Inlet. Usually, I'd roll my eyes at that kind of talk, but standing there staring at those bizarre prints and that torn-up crab, I started to wonder if maybe there was more truth to those rumors than I ever let myself believe. I could have gone further into the dunes, but a voice in my head said enough was enough. Besides, the sun was climbing, and if I was going to catch anything worth taking home, I needed to focus. So I returned to my spot, but my heart wasn't in it. I found myself scanning the beach every few minutes, half expecting to see something or someone watching me from behind a sandy ridge. I tried to chalk it all up to an overactive imagination, but that weird feeling never quite left. When I finally packed up, I ran into a young couple who'd come out for a morning walk. They asked if the fishing was any good, and I just shrugged and said it was slow. Part of me wanted to tell them about the tracks, but I was too spooked, afraid they might think I was trying to scare them. On the ferry ride back to Patchogue, I bumped into an older fisherman I recognized from the local marina. He noticed I was tense and asked if something happened on the beach. I mentioned finding strange prints, and he just nodded solemnly, mumbling about all the strange chatter around Fire Island, people claiming they've heard howls at night or found shredded remains of fish way up in the dunes. He didn't elaborate much, but that nod spoke volumes. I keep replaying it in my head, how those tracks ended so abruptly, how the crab shell was gouged clean. It's not the sort of thing you can just forget overnight. Since then, I've heard from a friend who surfs near the Fire Island lighthouse that he saw something dart across the sand one evening, a tall shape that didn't move like a dog or a deer. He never got close, but he swears it was gone in a blink, and the footprints it left behind looked vaguely similar to what I described. I'm not one to jump to conclusions, but this experience rattled me good. It's a big world, and even in places as familiar as Fire Island, there may be corners that hold more mystery than we realize. If I've learned anything, it's that the beach can be downright eerie when you venture off the beaten path. I'm writing to you because I need to get this off my chest before it consumes every last bit of my sanity. I hope you can understand where I'm coming from. I live in Phoenix, and I've always considered myself a pretty standard camper. Definitely not a rookie, but not some hardened wilderness guru either. Anyway, this happened on a trip up to the Grand Canyon National Park around mid-October of last year. You know how it's still warm during the day, even that late in the season, but the nights can drop surprisingly quickly into that biting chill. That chill was the least of my worries, though. I arrived at the Desert View campground on the South Rim. I'd been here a few times before, and it never fails to amaze me. The first day was typical: bustling tourists, lined up RVs, families taking selfies at scenic overlooks. Just the usual. But the second night, that's when things took a turn. I remember I was just sitting by my fire, poking at the embers and thinking about how the earliest explorers once believed the canyon held hidden passages to lost civilizations. I'd read some old story about a secret Egyptian tomb rumored to have been discovered in the early 1900s by an explorer named Kincaid. Some folks say it's a hoax, others swear the Smithsonian covered it up. I started wondering if there was any truth to all that, if maybe the government hid it for some obscure reason. My mind was swirling with those thoughts when I heard the first sound, like a low moan, but not quite human. It was distant, echoing off the rock walls, so faint it almost disappeared into the wind. At first, I chalked it up to the canyon itself. Those walls can play tricks on your ears, especially after sunset. But the noise came again, only a few minutes later. This time it was closer, more hungry, if that makes sense. I tried to ignore it and turned my attention back to the fire. I must have spent an hour just staring at the flames, thinking about the illusions out here in the desert, the swirling vortexes of Sedona, the rumored hidden bases near the canyon where some say the military conducts top-secret experiments. You hear these stories on late-night radio shows, stuff about interdimensional beings slipping in and out of our world, especially around remote areas. And I swear, that's when I started feeling it, a presence that kept me on edge, like someone or something was gliding between the pines just beyond my line of sight. I finally got up to do a perimeter check around my campsite. You know how it is. You have that paranoid moment. Did I attract a predator with my dinner scraps? Did I leave food out that might bring in coyotes or something? But there was nothing. The area was eerily silent, save for some rustling in the brush. The moon was bright enough that I could see the shapes of trees and boulders. And then it happened. I caught a glimpse of movement, a tall shape, unnaturally thin, stepping just behind a juniper. When I say tall, I mean it towered in a way that no human silhouette should. And though it was mostly hidden by the shadow, I could see something like an antler or twisted horn protruding from its head. My heart nearly exploded. I must have stood there for a good few minutes, wanting to dismiss what I saw as a trick of the moonlight. I managed to convince myself to return to my campsite, gather my thoughts, maybe steel myself enough to investigate more thoroughly. But I couldn't shake the dread. It's like the night itself turned thick and heavy. Finally, I crawled into my camper, locked it up tight, and tried to calm down. I woke around 2 a.m. to scratching sounds, not violent, but deliberate. My immediate thought was that it could be the wind brushing a tree branch against the side, but we both know that's the excuse you use when you don't want to face the reality of something unnatural. I tried to hold my breath, straining to hear anything else. Then came a peculiar clicking noise. It reminded me of a cross between an insect's chirp and an attempt at human speech, but it didn't belong in this world. Every hair on my body stood on end. Back in Phoenix, I'd read about the Wendigo from up north, an Algonquian legend typically associated with frigid climates, cannibalism, and dark, ravenous spirits. It never occurred to me that anything like that would ever lurk in the desert. But in that moment, with the primal fear pulsing through me, that's exactly what popped into my head. I wondered if these legends can manifest anywhere desperation or a certain malevolence thrives. Then came the stench. My God, that stench. It was like rotting meat combined with decaying leaves. It overwhelmed every sense, and I nearly gagged. The next thing I recall is hearing what must have been my own voice in a strangled sort of whimper as I tried to keep quiet. I also remember distinctly thinking about the conspiracy swirling around the Grand Canyon, the rumored lost city hidden somewhere beneath the rocky crags, the bizarre sightings of reptilian creatures near certain caves. My mind was running wild. What if the government does know about something that resides here? Something that defies classification, and they keep it all quiet to preserve the park's image. The scratching and clicking died down after what felt like forever, but might have only been 10 or 15 minutes. When I finally emerged from my camper at dawn, heart pounding, hand trembling around a flashlight, I half expected to see blood, footprints, or some sign of savage intrusion. But there was nothing except a series of faint, elongated impressions in the dirt. They didn't look like any prints I've seen. I've spent time in northern Arizona, southwestern deserts, you name it. I've seen coyote tracks, javelina tracks, random scuttles from lizards. These were different, like splayed-out handprints, but distorted, elongated fingers. I can't even say for certain they were tracks, but they definitely didn't look human. I felt disoriented and irrationally angry at the silence around me, as if the canyon was mocking my terror. I thought about packing up and leaving immediately. Yet a strange curiosity rooted me there until mid-morning, convincing me to scope the grounds for other clues. People around the campground seemed normal, going about their day, unsuspecting. At one point, I overheard a ranger telling someone to stay on marked trails, but her tone was odd, almost like an unspoken warning. I kept my mouth shut. I mean, how do you casually mention to a park ranger you think a Wendigo or some spirit is skulking around? Finally, when I got on the road heading back to Phoenix, I kept replaying everything in my head, wondering if it was all some delirious nightmare. But even a nightmare wouldn't explain those marks in the dirt, nor would it explain why I've had an uneasy feeling ever since, as if something followed me home, waiting, watching. There's a sense of being observed at odd hours, a chill that creeps across the living room in the middle of the night. Maybe it's just leftover paranoia, but it's intense enough that I needed to reach out to you. I apologize if this comes off as rambling. It's been gnawing at me for months, and the more I tried to make sense of it, the more tangled my thoughts became. I can't talk to anyone else about this, not seriously. Friends laugh it off or offer some rational explanation about coyotes or dehydration. Whatever I encountered up there wasn't simply an animal or a typical cryptid. It felt ancient, cursed, as though it carried centuries of darkness on its back. Some might call it a wendigo. Others might say it's a shapeshifter or something else entirely. I don't know. All I know is I never want to see it again. Welcome to Weird Encounters, a place where the ordinary fades into shadow and the unexplainable comes alive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and become part of our ever-growing community of the curious. Now prepare yourself, because what you are about to hear is not for the faint of heart. They say the woods can be peaceful, quiet, serene, even comforting if you're lucky. But what happens when that tranquility turns sour, when branches creak in the darkness, sounding more like beckoning fingers than swaying limbs, and an innocent hunting trip morphs into something else entirely? The following account, shared in the hope of shedding light on the strange and unsettling, might just make you think twice before wandering too far into the night. I've been a hunter in Arizona for most of my life. I'm no stranger to the hush of the forest at dawn or the booming echo of my rifle across the pines. Usually, that quiet is a comfort, but something happened last month in Coconino National Forest that I just can't shake. It was the weekend following that big storm we had in late August. You remember how the monsoon rolled in over Flagstaff and caused some minor flooding along Route 66? I'd planned a short hunting trip near the southern edge of the forest, off one of those lesser-known fire roads, somewhere between Munns Park and Mormon Lake. I don't even recall the exact forest road number, might have been FR 240, but they all start blending together if you've been out there as much as I have. I was set up near a ridge where deer are commonly spotted early in the morning. Nothing fancy. Just me, my rifle, and a battered old trail camera that I like to use for capturing wildlife footage. The day passed quietly, the only highlight being a near miss on a decent-sized buck in the late afternoon. So by the time dusk settled in, I was thinking about packing it in. That's when I heard the first howl. At first, I thought it could be coyotes. Lord knows they can sound pretty eerie. But this was deeper. It carried a resonance that made my stomach knot, like it was echoing from somewhere deeper than the throat of any canine I've heard. I set my gear down and pulled out my phone to record, just in case. I've got a few buddies who run a small cryptid discussion group, unofficially, of course, and I figured they might get a kick out of unidentified howls. But the more I listened, the less I felt like it was just some random wild animal. The calls had an almost anguished quality, like they were infused with human-like distress or fury. I remember that sudden chill rolling down my spine as the howls faded. I'm not saying the temperature dropped or anything. It was more an internal cold, like an instinctive warning. I started thinking about all the stories I'd heard from locals, even some whispered by older folks who claim Navajo blood. Tales of skinwalkers, shapeshifters said to prowl remote corners of the Southwest. They usually revolve around the Four Corners area or the Navajo Nation, not so much around Coconino. Still, the desert nights can hide anything. I tried to shrug it off, double-checking my surroundings. The pines were thick, and occasionally a gust of wind would send the smell of damp earth swirling around me. You know how strong the scent of pine can be when everything's wet. Then, out of nowhere, something bolted across my peripheral vision, too tall for a coyote, too fast for a human. It was just a flicker of a shape between the trees. But I swear, it moved almost like a man on all fours, then half rose, then disappeared again. My heart pounded against my rib cage so hard, I was sure it would spook every creature in a mile radius. I found my head spinning with random thoughts. My mind jumped to the stories about secret government test sites near the Mogollon Rim, half-baked rumors that they're messing with genetic experiments or advanced camouflage suits. Seems far-fetched, but in that moment, I'd have believed just about any conspiracy theory to explain what I'd witnessed. Could it be a feral person? A soldier gone AWOL from some covert facility? Or maybe it was nothing more than a big elk in poor light. But no. The shape was too angular, too wrong. I decided to hunker down behind a large ponderosa, phone in one hand, rifle in the other, just listening. That's when the howls started up again, but this time from multiple directions. It felt like a twisted call and response routine. One would sound off to my left, long, moaning, and guttural, followed by another from somewhere behind me. My phone mic was picking it up, but the recording sounded muffled, probably because I was shaking so badly, trying to keep quiet. At one point, I managed to glance at my watch, close to midnight by then. I should have been back in Flagstaff, warm in a motel bed, or at least camped near a more populated area. But I couldn't bring myself to move. Each time I thought about starting my truck, I got the uneasy feeling that stepping out of my cover would be a monumental mistake. That's when I smelled it. An odor that reminded me of roadkill left out in the sun, only sharper, like stale blood with a chemical edge. It's tough to put into words, but my stomach lurched, and I had to swallow hard to keep from gagging. I flashed back to a conversation I'd had years ago with a friend who claims he encountered a skinwalker near Tuba City. He mentioned a stench that made him physically ill, and how something about it felt unnatural, like a presence that defied logic. Could that really be happening to me now? I could almost hear his voice in my head telling me, when you smell it, it's already too late. If I'm being honest, I spent the next few hours just on edge, picking up faint movement in the corners of my vision. The forest was alive, but not in the usual way. There were no crickets chirping, no owls hooting, just the sporadic rustle of underbrush and the occasional crack of a branch. I kept thinking about how the Hopi, the Zuni, various tribes, they all have legends, often with similar threads about spirits or beings that can take on forms to deceive. The Navajo call them skinwalkers, witches that can don animal skins and shapeshift at will. I never imagined I'd be worrying about that lore in the middle of a hunting trip, but there I was. By around 4 a.m., everything died down. As first light crept through the treetops, I finally mustered the courage to inch my way to my truck. The forest felt like it was holding its breath. I started the engine, half expecting something to lunge at my window, but nothing happened. The drive back to civilization was a blur, with the sunrise painting the sky pink and orange, a stark contrast to the dread still coiling in my gut. I listened to the audio I'd captured once I got home. Chills ran through me all over again. The howl sounded almost human, like a person wailing in pain and anger, but layered with a resonance too deep for any normal vocal cords. I sent a clip to one of my buddies in that cryptid group, and he was dumbfounded, said he'd never heard anything quite like it. Part of me wants to share it widely, see if maybe a wildlife expert can ID it, but a bigger part of me worries about what they might say, or if somehow I'll draw attention from something I shouldn't. I haven't told many people about this, and the few who know think I'm either sleep-deprived or spooking myself with old legends. But the memory of that night lingers. Sometimes I'll be out walking in the early evening in my own neighborhood, and a dog's bark will catch me off guard, sending my mind racing back to those howls. I'm not sure if skinwalkers are real, but I can't deny what I heard, what I smelled, and that fleeting shape I saw weaving through the pines. Maybe someone else has had a similar experience in the Coconino. Or maybe it's just another unsolved piece of the puzzle out here in the high desert. I still can't go out hunting without scanning the tree line and feeling that little spike of terror in my gut. It might fade over time, but then again, maybe not. Stay safe out there. There's a peculiar quiet that settles in the desert at night, beautiful in its own way, but also so vast and unyielding that a single strange light in the sky can tilt your world off balance. Take the Petrified Forest National Park in Arizona, a place where ancient wood turned to stone becomes a silent chorus of eons past. But for one camper, it wasn't the fossilized remains that stole the show. It was the flicker of something high above, something that might defy any ordinary explanation. First of all, let me say this is the only place I can think to send my experience without being called outright crazy. I'm usually pretty grounded. I've been traveling around Arizona for years, checking out the unique geology and camping whenever I can find a spot off the beaten path. But late last month, I decided to camp near the Petrified Forest National Park, out by the Painted Desert area, specifically on the north side not far from the Painted Desert Visitor Center. The idea was to capture some night sky photography because they say the stargazing is incredible out there, far from city lights. I got in on a Friday evening, May 19th, 2024 if memory serves, had my little campsite set up. Nothing fancy. Just me, my tent, a fold-out chair, and a cheap radio that only managed to pick up a faint station out of Holbrook. The stars were coming in bright, and I remember feeling that sense of awe, like you do when you look up at a clear desert sky. Around 11 p.m., that's when I noticed the lights. At first, just a single orb drifting overhead, strangely silent. Then two more appeared, forming a sort of triangular pattern. They weren't blinking like commercial airplanes, and they moved with an almost unnatural smoothness. No sound, no sonic boom, nothing. I grabbed my phone, tried to record, but it was too dark, and the camera picked up only blackness with a few shaky specks. By now, my heart was in my throat. I recalled hearing about UFO sightings in northern Arizona, but I'd always dismissed them as misidentifications of satellites or maybe military planes out of Luke Air Force Base. This was different. These lights would hover, then zip to another position in the sky in the span of a breath. It looked purposeful, like something scanning the area. Sometime around midnight, I saw a faint beam shoot down from one of the lights, illuminating a patch of desert, then vanish. I swear, I felt the hair on my arm stand on end, like there was an electrical charge in the air. Part of me wanted to jump in my car and drive until I hit the nearest gas station, but I couldn't move, couldn't look away. Another beam flickered on and off in a different spot, farther out near some of the petrified logs. The orbs regrouped, then simply shot off in unison toward the horizon, disappearing in a split second. I stayed up half the night, too wired to sleep. I kept replaying the sight in my mind, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was some advanced drone technology, or a group of them. Then my mind drifted to the hush-hush rumors you hear every so often. Government programs testing next-gen aircraft in remote desert areas, stealth technology that baffles the senses. You wouldn't think the Petrified Forest would be a prime testing ground, but who knows? The next morning, I was at the Painted Desert Visitor Center, hoping maybe someone else saw the same thing. I overheard a couple of folks talking about lights they'd spotted from their RV sites. One lady said it looked like a triangular ship, and a guy mentioned he thought it was an experimental plane. Another older man quietly suggested it might be something out of Area 51 or the White Sands Missile Range that had drifted too far north. Everyone seemed on edge, uneasy, like they wanted more answers, but also didn't want to stir any trouble. That's when things took a weird turn. I got approached by two men wearing black suits. Yes, the cliché men in black ensemble. One had dark sunglasses, even though we were indoors, and the other didn't. Neither wore name tags or had any agency logos. They just walked up calmly and mentioned they'd heard I'd been asking questions about the unusual light activity last night. They didn't introduce themselves, but they had an air of authority that rattled my nerves. I felt cornered in that visitor center hallway, and I remember fumbling my water bottle as they stared me down. They implied it'd be best if I didn't go sharing unsubstantiated rumors. They stressed that advanced aircraft exercises happen in Arizona more often than people realize, and that local news outlets sometimes blow stories out of proportion. I tried to explain that I only wanted to figure out what I'd seen, but they gave me a look I can only describe as a silent warning. Then they turned and walked away as abruptly as they'd arrived. I quickly got the sense from people milling around that these men in black had cornered a few other witnesses that morning as well. One woman quietly shared how they asked for her phone, demanded to see any footage. She was too scared to resist. Another guy, who apparently had some sort of high-end camera setup, said they told him his images were confiscated in the interest of national security. Everyone was rattled, whispering about government cover-ups, advanced technology, and how the desert might hide more secrets than we'll ever know. As the day wore on, I drove through parts of the park, picking up bits and pieces of more accounts from visitors and staff. Some folks said they saw an unmarked helicopter pass overhead around 2 a.m., scanning the area with a spotlight. Others woke to a bizarre hum that set their teeth on edge. A park ranger apparently shrugged it off, saying it was probably just a refueling run or a rescue chopper. But you could see in her eyes she wasn't entirely convinced by her own explanation. By the time I left the park that afternoon, I had too many questions and absolutely no answers. We've all heard the stories about big black trucks pulling up to UFO witnesses' homes, or men in dark suits intercepting them at the grocery store, telling them to keep quiet. I always chalked that up to lore, some modern boogeyman tale. Now, having met these men in black face to face, I'm not so sure. I keep thinking about those lights, the unnatural way they moved. I can't help but believe this is some high-level government tech, like stealth drones or advanced aircraft that can defy typical flight physics. Maybe they were running a test, and the last thing they want is a bunch of tourists posting videos online. But then I wonder, why so extreme? Why show up in person at a national park, basically intimidating random visitors who caught a glimpse? Anyway, that's the whole strange affair. I know I'm rambling here, but it's tough to recount without getting a bit flustered. My only hope is that someone else reading or watching your YouTube channel might step forward with a similar experience, or maybe some insider knowledge. I'm not trying to stir up trouble. I just need to make sense of what happened. The desert has always held its share of mysteries, but this one feels especially unnerving. Thanks for reading. I'm still not sure if I'll ever look up at a desert night sky the same way again. And so, another strange encounter fades away. A trick of the mind, or something far more unsettling. That's for you to decide. Thank you so much for watching my stories. Make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Your support is what keeps this channel going.